Good Thursday morning. Welcome to Begin in the Word. Our text today comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24, beginning in verse 32, where Jesus continues, "From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man." Let's do a quick review before we get further into breaking down the text this morning. As we've noticed over the last few days of study, we have seen a breakdown in this chapter where Jesus organizes what he says really in two different categories, two different events that he's describing. He describes these things, and then he describes his coming. Now, we got to connect this back, of course, to Matthew 24, verse 3. This is the threefold question the disciples asked Jesus at the beginning of this chapter. Tell us, when will these things be? Which, of course, is what we're talking about here when we say these things. And then they say, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Which is, of course, the second heading here, your coming. That's the question that they're asking. When Jesus describes these things, he tells us that it will be a great tribulation among tribulations. This word tribulation is used a couple of times in the early parts of this chapter, one referring to the generic tribulations that fill the Christian age, and in particular, it's used again to describe the great tribulation of these things, which we have said, we have maintained is the destruction of Jerusalem and of the temple, and that will be abundantly clear, I believe, as we break down our text for today. This great tribulation among the tribulations, and he says, when you see the abomination of desolation in the holy place, so it's going to happen after a sign. You'll see this sign, the abomination of desolation. You look at the parallel accounts in the other Gospels, you know that that's the Roman armies coming upon the city. So when you see this sign, you know that it's about to happen. And he says, in fact, I have told you beforehand, warning them about the false Christ and all the things that will take place. He says, I've told you beforehand. He's warned them. He's given them the signs that will be coming. But as it relates to his coming, he says it's first of all after the tribulation of those days. And I take that to be the generic tribulations of the Christian age. At the conclusion, in fact, Jesus says immediately after the tribulation of those days, his coming will take place. And he tells us about his coming. It will be immediate. It's like lightning in the sky, flashing from one end of the sky to the other. It's rapid. It's fast. It comes without warning. It's obvious. Whereas he warned them beforehand about the abomination of desolation, he gave them a sign to look for. This coming is without warning. It's without sign. So you can see the contrast between these things, which is they're talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, because remember, they just left the temple and they're talking about the temple, and Jesus says, this temple's coming down. And they say, when will these things be? These things will come after signs. You'll know when it's coming. You can be warned, and he tells them what to do when all of these things happen. But as it relates to his coming, it's obvious, it's immediate, it's without warning, and it comes after the tribulation of those days. So with this kind of breakdown of two different days that Jesus is describing, we can look at our text. And if you haven't been convinced that Jesus is talking about two separate days, interweaving that material throughout this chapter, I believe these verses will make that abundantly clear, verses 32 through 37, that Jesus is talking about two different days. Remember, one day has no sign. It's going to come without warning, and another day has a sign, and it's going to come with warning. And Jesus refers to them, these two different days, as these things being one of the days, and then the sign of your coming as the second. Now, before we look at this text, I want you to notice how Jesus uses these words, these very words that the disciples used in his answer to them. So when he says in verse 38, so when you see all these things, you know that he is very near. And he says in verse 34, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. We have to draw a straight line between these things that Jesus says there in verse 33 and 34 back to these things that the disciples ask about. And remember the second part of their question, what will be the sign of your coming? Well, Jesus uses that very language in verse 36 and verse 37. Concerning that day and hour, no one knows, for as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. So we draw a line between your coming and the coming of the Son of Man. We have to connect all this together. Jesus is answering their question, these things, the sign of your coming. And he says in verse 32 through 35, what it will be like, or he describes the nature of these things. And then verse 36 and following, he describes the nature of your coming. So I hope you can see in this text that Jesus is taking these two different days and he's comparing and contrasting them. And we'll see that further as we go. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. Now he gives a quick little short parable, if you will. As soon as the fig tree's branch becomes tender, it puts out leaves, you know that summer is near. You see the sign. As soon as its branch becomes tender, as soon as it puts out its leaves, those are the signs. And the reality is that summer is near. He says you're good at deciphering the signs of the fig tree. You see these characteristics the fig tree takes on. And then when you see them, you know that summer is immediately following. And he says, just like that, when you see these things, connecting back to their question in verse 3, the abomination of desolations in the holy place, he says, you know that he is near. You see the sign, and the reality is shortly thereafter. Now remember, he says that the coming of the Son of Man won't have a sign, so he can't be talking about that in this verse. He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. In fact, it's a little clue when he says, at the very gates, the armies surrounding the city. And he says something in verse 34 that is paramount to understanding this text. I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. These things of the question of the disciples back in verse 3 will happen in the lifetime of this generation. There are some who want to retranslate the Greek word generation to mean until this people, this tribe will not pass away. In other words, the Jewish people will live on up until the end of time. And that's not the natural meaning of the word at all. And I don't know of any translation that puts it that way. Jesus says this generation, the natural, obvious reading is the people alive that are hearing him speak. He says the people in my audience, this generation, it's not going to pass away until the temple is destroyed. Now, almost 2,000 years have passed since Jesus spoke these words. He clearly cannot be referring to the coming of the Son of Man under this heading, under verses 32 through 35. Because that generation is dead and gone. So that's the one day. That's these things. There is something that's significant, Jesus says, that's going to happen in the lifetime of my audience. But look at verse 36. This word right here is paramount. But concerning that day and hour. There's all kinds of ways in the Greek language to conjoin sentences. And there's a particular word that is used very frequently in the Greek. It is the Greek word day. And that word means but. Sometimes it can mean and, but very often it means but. It's meant to be an adversative conjunction. That's kind of the technical Greek grammar phrase. It's an adversative conjunction. And the point of saying it is to set up a contrast. Jesus says, I've described these things and what it will look like. But by way of contrast, now I'm going to refer to something different concerning that day and hour no one knows. So whatever Jesus is describing in verse 36 and 37 is a different event, a different day than what he has been describing in verses 32 through 35. These things, that's within the lifetime of these hearers. But verses 36 and verse 37, he says, no one knows when that will be. Not the angels, not even the Son, only the Father. And he tells us in verse 37 what day he's talking about. It is the coming of the Son of Man. And we'll look at this in tomorrow's video when he talks about what it was like in the days of Noah. But the point about the days of Noah is that it was unexpected. The people around didn't know this was coming before the floods came. So just like it was unexpected and it came upon them in a hurry in the days of Noah, so it will be in the coming of the Son of Man. These things, it is expected, it is predicted. There are signs, just like the fig tree teaches, there are signs that indicate it is about to happen. But the coming of the Son of Man is a very different thing. So I hope as we've looked at verses 32 through 37, it's become clear that Jesus has been and is talking about two separate days. A lot of the misunderstanding in Matthew 24 comes because people don't understand the nuance of the 2 days. They think this is all either about the destruction of Jerusalem, and the coming of the Son of Man is just a metaphorical way of describing the destruction of the temple. But if that's the case, we have a real problem in verse 36, because Jesus says, he tells us when it's going to happen. This will happen in your lifetime. But of this other day, he says, not even the Son knows when it's going to happen. So it can't be talking about the same thing. So on the one hand, you've got those who say it's all about the destruction of Jerusalem. On the other hand, you've got those who say this is all about the second coming of Jesus, or maybe a post-tribulation rapture, some premillennial secret coming of the Messiah. They might put it towards some future event that they think will happen. But if that's the case, verse 34 makes no sense. Because all of these things, referring to these things, back in verse 3, all these things will happen in this very generation. You see, Jesus is describing two separate days. He's answering their question, as we should expect him to be doing. Tomorrow, come back, we're going to dig into the days of Noah, and specifically what Jesus says we ought to be doing as we await for the return of the Son of Man. Thank you for joining us today as we have begun in the Word of God. It's my hope that just as you have started today in the Word of God, you'll live out today in the Word of God.